Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for another session of EI Live for K-12 students and educators, brought to you by the Earth Institute at Columbia University. My name is Cassie, and I'm the director for the Office of Education and Outreach, and a big part of my job is bringing our scientific research to different audiences. For those of you who are joining us for the first time and aren't familiar with the Earth Institute, our core mission is to foster a greater understanding of the science behind sustainability and the climate crisis and what we as global citizens can do. Experts that make up the Earth Institute include earth scientists, economists, business and policy experts, and specialists in public health and law. The Institute is made up of more than 24 research centers and several hundred people who collaborate across many different disciplines and schools across Columbia University. What we're hoping to do with these EI Live sessions is to introduce you to our interdisciplinary work through our experts. We're going to have sessions until the end of June for K-12 students and educators. So today we're going to hear from Joan Lopez, who is the program manager of the Youth, Peace, and Security program at the Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity, AC4 for short. And AC4 is one of those research centers that are part of the Earth Institute. So today he is going to discuss the methods and practices of peace building and social innovations through the use of social labs in Medellin, Colombia, and explore how the science of peace building is used to identify deeply rooted social problems. We encourage our viewers to share ideas, concerns, and questions about the social problems you're witnessing via the Q&A box. And just a point to take note of today, we're going to be using the Q&A box and not the chat box. So once Joan is finished with his presentation, we are going to collectively discuss approaches and methods to addressing some of those challenges that you've identified. And if you have a question at any time during the presentation, feel free to also use that Q&A box, and we'll do our best to answer all of the questions that come through. Once the session is done today, we're going to share a link with everyone who registered for the event so you can access the recording later on. We'll post it to YouTube by the end of this week. So please email me directly if you're having any technical difficulties or if you have any additional questions about the EI Live K-12 programming. So without further ado, here is Joan. Take it away.
Thank you, Cassie, for the presentation, and hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So I am Joan Lopez, and as Cassie mentioned, I work at the Earth Institute, and I am also instructor in the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution master's program in the Schools of Professional Studies, and an adjunct professor of cultural anthropology at City College, CUNY. I am from Colombia, and I've been doing this work in Medellin for already, it's going to be 6 years. I am going to share with you this particular way of addressing, of approaching problems, especially among youth that have to do with violence, with urban, rural, political violence. And we are going to look at this idea of the social labs to better understand not only how to address these issues in a way to comprehend them better, but also to try to find ways to transform these issues. So I will take you a little bit through the trajectory that has led myself and my colleagues from AC4 to develop or execute actually this idea of the social labs. So let's start first with just very briefly talking about the Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity, which is housed at the Earth Institute. And the idea, sort of the overall philosophy or part of it, is that at this center, we try to comprehend conflict, transformation, and peace building through the lenses of complexity and systems thinking. And in AC4, there are 4 signature programs that try to comprehend conflict and peace building from a particular element. So the first one is Women, Peace, and Security, which looks at the positionality, at the experience of women in terms of peace and security, and how does that play out. The other one is the Environment, Peace, and Security, which has to do explicitly with the physical environment and the role and the position that it has in peace and security. The third one is Sustaining Peace, which has to do more with the theoretical aspect, especially of peace building. So what are those elements in systems that contribute to making peace possible? And what are those elements in the system that inhibit the production of peace, the manifestation of peace to take more force? And the last one is the Youth, Peace, and Security program, which is the one where I work particularly. And here is where we look at the experience, the condition of youth in the matter of peace and security. This Youth, Peace, and Security program is directed by Dr. Beth Fisher Yoshida, and also by Professor Aldo Chivico. And so this is the core team of the Youth, Peace, and Security program. So about 6 years ago, in thinking about the problem of youth violence around the world, the three of us said, how are we going to approach this? How are we going to learn about what are those elements, those conditions that produce and reproduce violent conflicts among youth, especially in urban areas? So with the end of the Cold War, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, where most of the violent conflicts were being disputed in more rural areas, these conflicts started to merge, to move towards urban areas, and especially to having at the center the youth. So after '89, there was a big shift in terms of violent conflicts that moved, right, from rural to urban areas. So we wanted to understand how was this taking place. Because Professor Aldo Chivico had been working for almost 20 years in Colombia, in Medellin, especially among ex-paramilitary members. He thought that we could go to Medellin to look at this phenomena, this urban phenomena, due to various reasons. So one of them, which is very important, is that Medellin represents, if you will, a microcosm of the longest internal social and political conflict, at least in this hemisphere, in post-modernity, right? As some of you might know, for 60 years, there was a civil war in Colombia, which was disputed between left-wing guerrilla movements, the government, of course, with the military, and paramilitary paramilitary groups that were very close, very close, to say the least, with the official military forces of the country. So after '89, this conflict in Colombia proceeded. It began in the 60s as many guerrilla movements and political conflicts began, but after 89, it didn't finish in Colombia, but it started to move from, as I said before, rural areas more into urban areas. So with the conflict in Colombia, there has been a massive migration, forced displacement by people from all around the country into major cities. And one of these cities is Medellin, right? So in Medellin, you could see, if you will, the cultural, the social, the linguistic aspects of Colombia as a whole, and those of the conflict as a whole. So we thought that it is big enough to encapsulate profound dynamics of conflict, but it's also small enough to explore it as a whole, as a system, right? So Medellin is has a population of about 2.5 million people, whereas other major cities in Colombia, such as Bogota, have almost 18 million people. So Medellin sort of gave us, or we thought of it as a place where we could look at it as a whole, as a system. So it is an example of the shift of violent conflicts from rural areas into urban settings. This is very, very important. The violent conflicts deeply changed when they moved, right, from rural to urban settings. And Medellin shows us how this takes place. Also, the reason why we chose Medellin as this place to do our research, our practice, it's because we were not only, and we still are not only interested in looking at the conditions that produce violence, conflict, but we are also and very much interested about the elements of the system that have responded to these conflicts in peaceful ways, to understand more about peace, because as we know, there's a lot of knowledge about violence and conflict, but very little knowledge about peace and peace building. So youth-led community peace processes are exuberant and have had a historical political consequence in Colombia. There has already been, since the initiation of this massive displacement from rural areas in the country into the city, a response, especially by youth-led community leaders who have responded peacefully to these dynamics. And thus, it becomes a laboratory. Medellin becomes this place, this area where we could learn and then come up with ideas as to how to transform the dynamics of conflict. So how were we going to do this? Well, through fieldwork, of course, but through fieldwork from the lens of social transformation, not only for the sake of learning about the culture, the political chess, if you will, but for the sake also of using that to then cooperate in the making of peace building initiatives that are already present in the city. So we had the idea of fieldwork, but specifically for social transformation. And an important method that we have used that comes from the field, mostly from anthropology and also a little bit from sociology, which is participant observation, which is this idea that social scientists should not only engage in observing the phenomena, the social phenomena of their places where they are doing research, but they should also participate in these cultural, social practices to have more of an insight, more of a transparent understanding the setting. So when we are talking about transformation, then we are talking about power. And I offer here a very simple definition of what power is, and it can be understood as transformative capacity. So the ability to transform is power. And this was offered by a British sociologist in '79. Now, once in the field, once we're engaging in participant observation, once we're building relationships with local youth, community leaders, with not only youth community leaders, but community leaders in general, given that we are in a setting where there's a lot of conflict, we also thought about, well, why amidst, in the middle of all of these problems, Colombia, Medellin, hasn't completely perished. The dynamics of violence have not been able to completely erase human agency, the capacity of human beings to construct meaningful relationships, to make a life, to deal with trauma from the war, etc. So we asked the question, why aren't things worse? And this would guide, this would serve as a way to guide our experience in doing field work and in doing participant observation, to do it in a more focused way. And in trying to answer this question, we started to evidence what we then termed the repertories of peace building. In the setting, in Medellin, in this case, not only are there dynamics that produce and reproduce violence, but there are dynamics of peace building that have to do a lot with community building. So as people started to get to arrive to Medellin, being forcibly displaced from their home, they started to build technologies, tools, practices together to first put together their new homes, but then also to combat, to respond peacefully to this political violence that also followed them from these rural areas. And as I said, all of these practices, all of these tools, all of these very sophisticated technologies, we call them repertories of peace building. I am going to share a short video so that you have more of a visual about these repertories of peace building that I am talking about. And this video comes from the Center of Historical Memory that is trying to encapsulate, to collect, as it were, testimonies around the country as to how people have been able to, in the middle of conflict, of violence, construct ways and actually transform these dynamics of violence.
¿Y qué es arte? Sino referencia a la lucha. ¿Y qué es arte? Si no sirve a la comuna. ¿Y qué es arte? Expresión de mi cultura. Calles, aromas, experiencias vividas. Es distinto conocer el camino que transitar por él. Tener memoria, utopías, crear dolor, muerte. También transitar producto no de libros y academias que fastidian.
Arte es lo que tú haces cuando caminas las calles, labrando palabras sabias y subversiones en los corazones errantes, para que se otorgue alma a la asistencia, se aniquile el miedo y el amor nos sorprenda. Arte es lo que tú haces cuando decides un nuevo comienzo, rompes cadenas, desnudas mentiras y te juegas por la vida. Y en los caminos que se cruzan, construye la verdad de horizontes justos que no dan marcha atrás. Solo te atreves a luchar, solo te atreves a soñar. Arte es lo que tú haces cuando te atreves a caminar. Arte es lo que tú haces cuando decides la libertad.
en 2002, cuando hubo la primera operación militar mariscal, cuando desde las 12 de la medianoche hasta el mediodía había un enfrentamiento gigante y que no habían podido, pero había muchos muertos, muchos heridos.
Una operación sin precedentes en lo que ya teníamos porque fue muy larga y porque casi siempre caían, disparaban, mataban gente o no y se abrían. Esta vez querían entrar, ¿cierto? Entonces como que empezaron a presionar más de la cuenta, pero adentro había también quien estallaba.
La población de la comuna hizo una cosa que para mí me marcó la vida y fue una acción no violenta que logró frenar esa operación militar. Es que todo el mundo empezó a salir, a vencer el miedo, a ponerle el pecho a las balas, como se dice, y salir con trapos, sábanas, pañuelos, camisas, con todo lo que tuviera blanco, a sus ventanas, a sus calles, a sus puertas.
Pero como que ese momento fue también muy de inspiración para la vida en general y para la élite especialmente, que es como ahí sí se puede hacer resistencia pacífica, si hay otras formas de decir las cosas, hay otros lenguajes además aparte de la violencia.
Vamos a tener una clase de graffiti y vamos a terminar en la parte periférica de las escaleras eléctricas.
And we're going to finish at electric escalators in the periphery of Comuna 13.
Entonces muy bienvenidos a la Comuna 13, espero conozcan las realidades.
Eso es un accidente. A nosotros un día nos dicen, viene un congresista norteamericano que es un man bien, que viene a hacer precisamente un informe sobre las repercusiones negativas del Plan Colombia en Colombia. ¿Los qué? A verlo, ¿dónde está para decir un par de cosas? ¿Por qué no se arman un recorrido por la 13? Que vaya hasta Zombatá y que conozca lo que ustedes hacen. Perro dice, parce, por la calle, graffiti no.
Este fue el último graffiti que hice, hace 3 días lo hice. Este es un proyecto que se llama Héroes de la 13.
Y por esos días yo había abierto Twitter, pues estaba como más cogiendo auge ahí. Mucha gente me estaba copiando, no sé qué. Y yo le dije, perrito, esto hay que hacerlo más, parce. Vos enseñás qué es el grafiti, yo enseño lo político, tal. Y hacemos el dúo perfecto, weón.
La Comuna 13 en el 2002, del 98 al 2002, sufrió un periodo de violencia muy fuerte.
From 98 to 2002, Comuna 13 saw a lot of violence.
Donde aquí estaban instaurados grupos al margen de la ley, de la guerrilla, ELN, las FARC, los CAP, que era el Comando Armados del Pueblo, eran los que en este sector habitaban.
Mira, yo creo que el resumen más grande y más específico del grafitur es el graffiti de Orión. A la izquierda está un poco de historia que hoy es realidad también de la violencia, y a la derecha están unos aviones disparando color y disparando pintura al territorio.
Sobreviviendo en el barrio donde se escuchan disparos, donde se muere la gente por culpa de algunos cuantos. El terror en mi comuna hizo parte del pasado, dejando amargos recuerdos. Corazones afectados. Muchos son los que han llorado por un ser que se ha marchado. Sientes que mueres por dentro al saber.
¿Qué es el grafitur para mí? Un recorrido histórico, estético y político por la Comuna 13, para vivenciar las historias de la Comuna 13, la estética de la Comuna 13 y las realidades de la Comuna 13 de manera directa, con habitantes de la comuna, con artistas y líderes de la Comuna 13, pero además con tu propia sensación de tenerla que sentir con los 2 pies, verla con los 2 ojos, oírla con los 2 oídos.
Tampoco queremos ver una ciudad muy rayada ni muy manchada, pero sí queremos verla con muy buenas obras de arte. Entonces como que vamos construyendo nuestra historia. A medida de lo que nosotros vamos viviendo, vamos contando nuestra historia de graffiti.
Historias nefastas, de masacres, de dolor, desplazamiento. Hay historias de esperanza, de color, de vida, una manera más simbólica y poética de decir que están haciendo muchas personas para ayudar a que un territorio salga adelante y sea un mejor vividero.
Okay, so in this video we're able to see some of these repertories of peace building that as we started to do our fieldwork imaging, we started to identify. Right, this is just an example of many others, not only in Comuna 13, as is shown in this video, but all around the city. And sometimes also in the peripheral areas of the city that are not politically engulfed, right, by the administrative and economic dynamics of the city hall, of the mayor's office. So looking at this, having identified these repertories of peace building, as I said, we then understood that as anthropologists, as experts of conflict transformation, of sustainability, we didn't really have much to offer other than to listen carefully and share some of those ideas that we put together in academia, but only to enhance what has already been working on the field, right? So this made us come up with a set of conceptual premises that I would like to share with you here. One is that youth cannot be reduced to being mere objects and perpetuators of violence. They are potent peace and community builders. The idea in some of the literature about violent conflicts is that the youth are violent actors. So they belong either to the guerrilla structures, paramilitary structures, the military, right? But they are deemed as not having an effect on the making of peace, right? So that's the first premise. The second one is that peace building processes begin amidst, in the middle of violent conflicts and not after, right? So as conflicts start to take place, at that same moment, processes of peace building also start to take place. So it's almost as this biological body that as it is penetrated by a foreign element that produces some sort of conflict, then the body reacts to it, trying to respond to it in a way to balance the problem. As violent conflicts escalate, processes of peace building also escalate, right? So this is also using this biology metaphor of virus and antibodies created, right, as conflicts escalate in a body politic in this case. Processes of conflict transformation emerge from within the conflict areas and do not come from outside. Though most of these processes are reactive, not systemic, and not sustainable, right? So this is something really important to understand, right? That the technologies, the practices of conflict transformation are in the field, not outside, but that a lot of these are not systemic and not sustainable. So that's where we also started to think about ways of sharing ideas of how to make them sustainable, systemic, etc. Grassroots processes of conflict transformation should inform theory in the field of conflict and vice versa. Right? So this is also an important aspect, and is that such as the academy, the research that is done at the academy, it's helpful to try to comprehend and to transform conflicts on the field. What takes place at the grassroots level, these processes also should inform theory, right? So there is a conversation almost between academia and the processes on the field around issues of conflict, of sustainability, of peace building. Lessons learned at the intersection between local processes of conflict transformation and the academic field of conflict can produce practices, technologies, and theories to approach conflict from a systemic lens. Okay, so a way for us to come up with practices, with theory around conflict transformation and sustainability should only be done at the intersection between what is being done at the academia and what's being done in the field, at the grassroots level. Another important finding was that community building is peace building. And this really was coined by the mayor of Palermo, an anti-mafia mayor that saw in his experience in Palermo doing anti-mafia political practices, that as you build community, peace building is also being done. And we were able to sort of test it and see that this is in fact the case. And lastly, but this is completely crucial, is that when social scientists engage in the research, but also in the more prescriptive, for the lack of a better term, part of research, this has to be done in a participatory way. That is, working shoulder to shoulder with the people that are on the ground, and not imposing a power dynamic that has more weight on one and not the other. So in 4 years of thinking about this in a theoretical way, identifying these repertories of peace building, trying to make sense of how they have been possible, how they were born, how they are sustained in time, what has been their effect on the overall conflict of the city, of the country. Then we entered a phase, more of a practical phase. How is it that we are going to use all of this knowledge? And when I say we at this point, we are now talking about also with our colleagues in the field, people that you saw in that video, like John Jaime, like Jacob, and many others. So how are we going to use this to come up with a project, with some initiatives to further enhance and transform these technologies, these repertories of peace building. So we started to think about a way to do this, and we found this social lab idea that was thought about at MIT by Saeed Hassan, which sort of lays out the foundations to engage in a prototyping for solutions of any conflict, be it social, political, or in a corporation, right, where there's conflict, how to engage in a way to transform these conflicts. And what Hassan tells us is that social labs sort of cut this conventional way of resolving social problems that are very linear, right? If you do A, then B happens, and then C happens. And this is more of a non-linear approach. So social laboratories, social labs are social, of course, because they try to resolve social issues. They are experimental, and this means that as you are embedded in the lab, right, as any other lab, you experiment, right? There is a trial and error process. They are also emergent, which means that solutions emerge as you are embedded in the process of working in the lab. They take a non-linear approach. This is really important, right? You have an idea of what you want to accomplish, but going from B to C has a lot of different organic processes that have to be accounted for. And then they take a systemic approach, which means that in order to resolve a particular issue in a system, in a given system, let's say Medellin in this case, you have to transform elements that are not only that particular issue. In this case, the issue of youth or violence among the youth. But you also have to tackle problems of income inequality, of gender issues, of environmental issues, right? In order to get to a better position of trying to resolve this problem of youth violence. So we said Medellin is indeed this place where we could develop this social lab. So let's do the following. Let's do a social lab that takes Medellin as a whole, and then take more of a localized lab, a smaller one that would serve almost as a prototype of the big one, of the Medellin-wide one. And let's look for a place where the problem of violence among youth is very high. So in Comuna 5, in Castilla, one of the neighborhoods there, we saw that this area represents 21% of this sector's population. So it's a big youth population, but it accounts for 50 to 60% of the violent deaths since the 90s in the city as a whole. Right? So out of the 32,880 youth that live in Castilla today, many belong to one of the 22 criminal groups that are present in this territory. So we said, let's focus the lab in Castilla for these particular reasons, and also because we had established partnerships with some community leaders already in Castilla. So part of the social lab method is, because it's systemic in nature, you have to have the representation of every sector of the system, right? So in the case of Castilla, we mapped out the stakeholders, right? The representations of the whole neighborhood. And we said, well, youth community leaders are one important stakeholder that represent a particular experience. The city government has to be present, right? It also represents a particular experience in this territory. The community government as well has to be present. The police, the private sector, academia indeed, educational institutions, so high schools, elementary schools, and of course the gangs, right? So this, by having on the same table all of these stakeholders, you have almost a live map of the system representing each one of the sectors, and this is really important for the lab to take place. So together, once we put the stakeholders on the same table, of course, with the help, with the support, with the guidance of the local community leaders, we were able then to map out the status quo of Castilla. What happens in Castilla? Why is it that there is violence, but why is it that things are not worse? Remember this question in Castilla. And we were able to, in a cartoonish way, as you see here, have a visual about the status quo, right? So there are here the yellow elements are the ones that inhibit processes of peace building, right? So in the case, if you look at the environment category there, the middle says protective environments. What inhibits people, dynamics in Castilla to have a more protective environment? Well, they came up with things such as threats to and murders of community leaders, children who are rejected by their parents and family members, right? So all of this inhibit this sense, the experience of being in a place that, on an environment that feels protective, that feels safe, right? So we did this map using the dynamical system theory, which is a theory based on systems that allow us to look at the relationship between reinforcing elements and inhibiting elements around a particular issue, right? So protective environments, fear, peace building, community participation, right? So here we started to further answer this question, why aren't things worst, right? Because the blue ones are those that reinforce peace building, right? So in terms of peace building, that category that you see on the screen, you see that sports, resistance through the arts, graffitis, pacifist culture, all of these are the elements, right, that make things not being worst per se. So these maps are really helpful in order to at least have a visual, right, and to encapsulate also conversations, because this came out, this map came out of a conversation. Right. So one thing is to have in the method of the social lab. One thing is to have the map of stakeholders, then to be able to look at the status quo, right, of the system that you are trying to work in and transform, and this is done through the theory U method that Otto Scharmer proposes. And the idea here is that together, we are going to collectively construct a shared understanding of the system and its dynamics, right? So in order for us to come up with some solutions, we have to first come up with a shared understanding of the conditions that make the problem possible. And this is done through a reiterative journeys to sense and observe the system. So what we would do is walk around Castilla together, right, with that set of stakeholders that I just presented, walk around Castilla, listen to stories from gang members, from community activists, from church, from religious leaders, from everyday members of the community, right? And in that way, you start to sense, to observe better the conditions of possibility for on the one hand, violence to be recreated, but on the other, peace building to be possible. After these journeys, after we have been able to construct this collective understanding of the system, then the methodology asks for us to create a guiding question, right? So similar to that question that we had at the beginning about why aren't things worse in Medellin, we also came up with a question for this specific lab in Castilla. And from what we heard on these sensing and observing journeys is that security, the problem of being secured, of feeling secured or insecure, it's really at the center of a lot of the conversations. So we said together, what are those tools? What are the tools we need to generate in order to set the conditions to understand and build human security in Castilla? Very simple question that would help us continue the observing and sensing process, but also to start to identifying those areas, those reinforcers of peace building, to enhance them, right? And also to perhaps design new ones. So the question should not encapsulate the problem, right? And should not either suggest a solution. It's sort of a neutral question. Here are some pictures of some workshops, focus groups using DST, mapping the systems, etc. And this, then after having these questions set up, you enter into another phase of the lab, which is to start thinking about prototypes, right? Solutions. And the idea is to build between 3 and 6 prototypes to then test them. Once they are tested on the territory, of course, you have to go back to the system and engage in a process, again, of observation, of sensing, to see what has been the effect of these prototypes. So the first, these are only ideas for prototypes. These have not yet been executed, given the current world public health circumstances. But from the previous encounters that we as a community have had in Medellin, in Castilla, we came up with the idea of these community gardens that are present already in the neighborhood, and that, according to the people around them, have helped to, for example, demobilized or displaced, to use another term, some of the, for example, gang members in specific areas of the neighborhood. So this has to do with the environment, right? And also Medellin today is one of the cities in Colombia that have the highest levels of pollution, right? So working with the environment, they thought, and we all thought together, is really important. The other thing is coming up with campaigns, pedagogical, educational campaigns around the issue of human security. So what some members of the community were starting to do was to speak about the environmental problems that are impacting Castilla, and doing campaigns around it to share with the rest of the community. A third very important part is this, as people in Castilla say, beautification of the territory. And as we saw in the video, the role of the arts, of graffiti especially, of hip hop in general, has been very important historically to beautify some of the territories, to make them more friendly, to make them more beautiful, but also to resolve some historical issues. So it also serves as a way to recuperate historical memory and tell stories, as you saw on that video. Another thing is to generate alternative economic dynamics. Part of the problem has to do with income inequality, for example. Many youth join some of the gangs or the military or the police because there is no other alternative to generate some income. So making processes such as the one that you saw on that video, like a graffiti tour, for example, making those things more available, creating the conditions where these things can emerge, can also be one of those prototypes. Then draw from those small things that are working well and enhance them in a way that they can have more impact on the system, right? So we heard the story of this barber in the community that has a lot of legitimacy in the neighborhood, and as some violent conflicts would emerge close to his barber shop, he would come out and de-escalate this conflict. So what is there to learn about the practices, the way this barber approaches conflict and as a mediator, right? So we also were thinking about this idea of organic mediators, people that perhaps have not been trained academically, but more trained through life, through being in context of violence. How have they developed ways to de-escalate, to mediate conflicts? And then how to understand the notion of human security in local settings. And here we have put up a research project around notions of security in local settings. What do people think when they think about security? What are the experiences of security? What are the desires of security? What do we want to accomplish? How does security look like, right? It's the question. And this would give us lights as to how to proceed, right? So remember, the social labs to get together, to put together on a table, on a laboratory, if you will, a set of people, of institutions that represent the system as a whole, right? So we have a live, quote unquote, map of the system. Then when that is generated, when the system is, when the stakeholders, when that live map is generated, that whole group goes and senses and observes the system in a way that we could together, that they could together have a shared understanding of the system. What are the elements that produce the issue at hand? What are the elements that put resistance to the issues at hand? And then from there, a process of prototyping begins. What is working well? What can we enhance? What do we need from outside, etc., in order to start transforming the system, right? In the methodology, this is called prototyping. Then the next part is to execute these prototypes and to then go back into the sensing and observing part, this theory that Sharma suggests, in order to start seeing what are the effects of these prototypes, which ones have worked, which ones have not, how can we change things within them, do we need new ones, etc. Right? So this is then this organic process, this process that has to be done in a reiterative way, not once and for all, and it's long term. That's really important. So this finishes my presentation, and I just want to ask of you to think. I know that most of the participants of this session are high school students, and to think of any issue that affects everyone in your school and that you think should be transformed. And also to think about who are the stakeholders, and also to think about why aren't things worse, right? Why isn't that this issue has completely taken over the school? So we can discuss this, and also if there are questions, comments, etc., we can start having a conversation.
Great, thanks, Joan. So I just want to be cognizant of time. So we have about 10 minutes left in the session. For those of you who have already typed your questions, thank you. And for others, if you do think of the presentation along with some questions, or if you want to talk about a particular situation, we can definitely connect you to Joan afterwards if you want to continue that conversation. So I just, because I want to respect everyone's time. So Joan, a couple of questions have come up, and between Adrian and myself, we will ask them kind of in the order that they've come in. I'm going to start actually probably a more recent one here. So this was specifically about the youth in Colombia, and what percentage of youth do you think are estimated to be affiliated with criminal groups? And maybe you can speak from a Medellin perspective.
Yeah, I do not have the exact percentage, but in the estimation that I suggested here, at least in Castilla, it's about 20%, but this is particularly of Castilla.
Okay, great, thank you. And would you label these processes as a domino effect, because as conflict increased, peace-building organizations also increased?
Well, I wouldn't see it as a, I mean, perhaps there are two domino effects working in tandem. One of conflicts, of violent conflicts, and one in tandem as peace-building processes. But how I conceive this, it's more of and I suggested this formulation: as one escalates, the other one also escalates to try to balance it, to try to not let violence take over completely. right? So it's almost like a biological mechanism in place.
Okay, thank you. So there was a question early on about two questions from the same individual. The first part is, Colombia looks like a mixed race country. Was the civil war fought between races, or were the two fighting parties racially mixed? So I'll let you answer that before I go to the next one.
Sure. Yeah. So this one, yeah, no, it is a mixed race country. And the civil war was mostly fought between political ideologies. So liberal ideologies against conservative ideologies. And the liberal ideologies were then morphed into left-wing guerrilla groups. And so from different parties, there is a mix of race.
Okay, great, thank you. And the second part of the question was more about current trends, and if there is still a big migration flow from Colombia into the US. Yeah, what are your, what do you know about the current situation?
Yeah, no, I mean, there was a big migration from Colombia to the US, but mostly during the 90s and beginning of the 2000s, due very much to narco trafficking, the impact of narco traffic in the country. But lately, it's not the case.
Great, thank you. And there was a question specifically about the gangs. So how might they be enticed to cooperate? Is anything being offered to them by the committees?
So one of the findings, not only in Colombia, but all around, is that youth that are in gangs are there because they are looking for an economic income, right? Some form of income to meet some necessities. So it isn't because people are utterly bad, let's say, or they are violent. It's because they are looking for a way to meet basic needs. So if there is an alternative presented to these youth, they take the alternative that is not violent. It's almost a 100% proven formula.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to bow out and actually ask the last question here, and then Adrienne is going to take over for the rest of the Q&A. So this is a fairly general question, but I think is very helpful to answer. Can you discuss some that have been proven to be most effective in your work?
The prototypes that have been most effective?
Which peace building methods?
Yeah. So one, it's this beautification of the territory. So for example, in some of these neighborhoods, there are different gangs in them, and the territories are disputed among these two or more gangs, and they construct invisible borders where people from one part of the neighborhood cannot cross into the other. This represents an issue of mobility. What we have seen is that art, particularly the making of a graffiti, the making of a concert, in these invisible borders, reconfigure the setting and allow people then to start crossing from one place to another. And this has been used historically in Medellin, from the stories we hear, as a way to tackle the problem of mobility, which is it's a human rights issue as well. So this is one of those things that we really pay attention to, the role of art in peace building and in reconfiguring spaces of violence.
Okay, we have a couple more sort of strategy methodology questions that have come in. So the first one What is the benefit of using a long-term research design in solving societal issues?
Yeah, we don't conceive of doing research in social research being short term, because societies morph continuously. Societies are in a perpetual state of flux, of change. And the only way for us to get closer to understanding a particular phenomenon in a society is to engage in a long-term way, to trace both the changes of the societies, but also those things that remain the same. Right? So the benefit is that you can trace change and stability, which is central to understanding social issues.
Okay, great. And then could you give an example of one of the most successful prototypes at building peace and also of an unsuccessful prototype?
Well, I kind of answered this in the previous one with the trying to enhance more the role of art, right? Specifically, let's say the building of a graffiti in a particular part of a neighborhood to enable people to have free mobility between two sectors of the same neighborhood, as one of the successful or let's say with signals of being successful. And in terms of the ones that have not been successful, sometimes have to do with coming to the last one that was on the list there, coming to a shared understanding as to what human security is. This is such a big theme, and we have had trouble coming up, trying to encapsulate all of these ideas of human security that live in this neighborhood. So this hasn't been successful.
Interesting. So I have one more question left. If anybody else has any more questions, I'd encourage you to put them in the Q&A box, though of course we can connect you with Joan if you have questions after the session. So the last question I have here is, in what ways would the government or people that are maybe higher in the status quo or the hierarchy in the system be able to get involved to help the community, especially as they may have more resources in order to help?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and of course there are hierarchies in societies, but one thing that is essential, if let's say a governmental official, a governmental institution wants to support, wants to be part of the creation of peace building in a particular community, it's to enter the system as another member of it, not necessarily as this top-down or within this top-down dynamic, but to listen to those things, especially that have worked well, right? Because in these environments where there's violence, where there has been violence historically, there are things that have been working very well to resist them. So it's how to channel resources from governmental institutions, for example, into the enhancement of these repertories of peace building that I talked about.
And another question has just come in. Are there lessons that the social labs can teach us in the United States as we confront racism and reversing racist policies?
I think so. And it has to do with conversation, with open conversations. The social labs have enabled us in Medellin to sort of create bridges or to close gaps between, and this is connected with the previous question, between governmental institutions with community leaders, for example, between gang members with community leaders that supposedly are almost enemies, right? So the method, the social labs method, in a way looks to concretely come up with prototypes to resolve things, but also part of the process, it's the opening of conversations that we have seen. It's very, very important in order to transform dynamics of violence, including, of course, tensions, whether of political ideologies, and as in the case of Colombia, but of racial frictions.
Okay, do you have any additional messages or thoughts that you'd like to share with our group today?
I will just want to share these two readings that can be found in the webpage of AC4 that have been written by Professor Fisher Yoshida and Professor Aldo Chirico and myself around our work with community leaders in Medellin.
Okay, great. So I guess we'll wrap up. If anybody has any further questions after the session, you feel free to reach out to us. Just a reminder, we'll still be doing these sessions every Monday and Wednesday from different topics through the end of June. Though keep in mind that our next session on Wednesday is going to be at 9 a.m. Eastern instead of the usual 2 p.m. Our researcher is doing his work in China and will be joining us there. So we had a bit of a time zone issue to resolve. So 9 a.m., but then going forward, we'll be back at the 2 p.m. slot. So thank you to everyone, and thank you to Joan for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.